being able to make that connection was very powerful for me, especially when you can take someone who's a hater and kind of get him to come around and be like, all right, I can agree that what people are doing, all these, everything that makes the headlines, right, is not representative of mainstream modern, Islamic thought and what mainstream modern Muslims, do or condone. That was very powerful for me.
Welcome to the My Future Business Show, where we get you in front of your best audience and keep you there. Not only are we interviewing the biggest names in business to help you become even more successful, we're inviting you to book your spot on the show to help you grow your business. So at the end of the call, make sure you fill in the interview application form at myfuturebusiness.com/interviews. Hi and welcome back to the My Future Business Show. My name's Rick Nusky. I'm the host, and on today's call I have Ahmed Rashed with me. He is the author of What Would a Muslim Say? Welcome to the show, Ahmed.
Thank you very much, Rick. Glad to be here.
It's one of those things where just prior to starting the call, everything can go wrong at the last moment, and often things get in the way. So it sounds like you've been fairly busy.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I am trying to find a place where my baby daughter's screams don't pick up on the microphone.
Oh, wonderful. That's just absolutely beautiful. Now, listen, this, like I mentioned earlier, I have very little understanding of this particular topic, so I'm hoping to talk about the truths behind what it is to be a Muslim in the Islamic faith. So, before we jump into that, I was wondering if you could share a little bit about yourself with the My Future Business audience.
Sure. My name is Ahmed Rashed. I was born in Egypt, raised in Maryland, and I came to Boston about 15 years ago. I was trained as a physicist and software engineer, so that's how I work, is I develop software for my company in the manufacturing environment.
Mm-hmm.
But what I do for a living is I explain Islam to people. That's kind of my calling. So
Yep.
the software pays for the bills, but this kind of outreach and interfaith work is what makes me, that motivates me to get up every morning.
It pays for the soul, doesn't it? That's that side of it.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. That's
It
it.
it seems like you have some wonderful reviews from various sources, various individuals who maybe don't know much about the faith, and it helps to educate people more on a conversational level, which I think is essential. But given that there is so much misunderstanding, misrepresentation from all parts, including the media today, I'd love for you to share, I guess, from the very ground level up, what this is all about.
If we go back a long time to when, my parents first came to this country, my parents were more cultural Muslims, not really religious. I mean, I went to the Friday prayers, we fasted in Ramadan, but I didn't really become kind of serious about my faith until I was in high school.
Mm-hmm.
Did a bit of a soul searching. I was going through a rough time in my life. And so that's when I kind of started researching all the different religions, and then, basically becoming a born again Muslim, if you will.
Yeah.
So that was nice. I kind of got, more into the culture, more into the rituals, kind of went to the mosque more often, started reading and studying. And then September 11, 2001 happened.
Mm.
So at that time, I was in Pennsylvania. I was actually studying for my master's degree in optical physics. And basically that day, I went into the classroom and I realized my professor wasn't there, and there's all these things on the news, and I was, and then basically the rest is history, right? You look and you see, the towers are
Yes.
falling and the people are very upset. I mean, the student cafeteria basically closed down and started giving free coffee, cakes, and cookies to people because it was very traumatic. I mean, in Pennsylvania, just outside of Philly, you're not that far from New York. And so a lot of people, a lot of the students, they had family there. In fact, myself, my own sister, at that point, she was living in New Jersey, but she was working in Manhattan. And of course, nobody could reach anybody on the cell phone. So it was a very, very stressful time. And what happened at that university, that was at my graduate school, is that basically the dean and the chairperson of the history department, religious department, and political science department kind of set up a table in the community quad and basically had an open conversation with the students. What are you feeling? How are you doing? Let's just talk about it, because this is a very unprecedented event in American history, just in history in general. And what kicked off my quote unquote trajectory is that one of the ladies that stood up, she had a lot of anger, and she was talking about how, she'd like to find the Muslims who did this and, kill them and shoot them and do this, that, and the other. And there was this kind of awkward silence as the dean and the chair people kind of look at each other. And I raised my hand and I asked if I could, respond to the young lady. So they gave me the mic, and I kind of made a review of American values about how we do not prejudge. We still know who actually did that. And even if it was Muslims who did this, this is not representative of our faith. And so I talked about, there's due process, we bring the people who did this to justice, but just because a person happens to share the same faith as the one who's a criminal doesn't mean that all people of that faith are criminals. And the rest, as they say, is history. Ever since that time, I've been getting, the various different people ask me to come and talk about Islam, either at, their political science clubs or their, religious interfaith clubs. And that's kind of where I started this whole process of fielding questions about my faith to people who, don't know. And what I found is that a lot of people, if you've not really met a Muslim or had them as your friend or as a neighbor, there's a lot of secrecy and mystery. It's like this weird religion, and it's very glamorized in a negative way
Hmm.
in the that if you're a Muslim, then they do this and they do that, and that really is not the case. So that's kind of where I started. I started volunteering more at my mosque. I joined the Speakers Bureau because I was one of the few Muslims who was many of the Muslims on campus that were observant of their faith. Most of them were immigrants, and so they didn't have their English wasn't very good, and most of the Muslims who were raised in this country weren't very practicing, so they could speak English very well, but they weren't very knowledgeable. And so I kind of filled the niche
Yeah.
of someone who had studied with the traditional scholars and read some of the traditional books, just because I'm a bookworm like that. But also I've been here in the United States since I've been 1 year old, so I was able to communicate and bring in cultural references, try to make people understand not necessarily why they should be a Muslim. That was never my angle, right? I'm never, I always tell people, I'm not trying to sell you Islam. I'm just trying to sell you accurate information about Islam. And that's kind of where my interfaith encounters always led me, about coming to a better understanding. If you're going to criticize or make comments or evaluate a religion, at least know what it is that you're actually evaluating, and not judge it by the fringe elements, which are mainly expressing their political or social grievances, and not actually fulfilling some religious mandate.
Yeah, it seems like they are lumped into the same box, especially due to the media exposure and the way that they portray certain events around the world. It's something that they should be held more accountable for. What is your take on when people hear of an incident? What should be their first response? Should it be, well, what are the facts behind this? How should they go about processing this as soon as somebody labels, a terrorist act or something of that description?
Well, criminals are criminals,
Yeah.
right? I mean, no religion has a monopoly on good people, and no religion has a monopoly on bad people. And, interestingly enough, if you look at many of the terrorist acts that people like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, they used to be doing, if you look at 80% of the victims, or more than 80% of the victims, were Muslims themselves.
Mm.
When ISIS carved out its borders in Syria and Turkey and Iraq, yes, there were some non-Muslim Zaydis and other ethnicities there, but the vast majority of the people that they were, ambushing and taking over the lands, they were other Muslims, right?
Mm. Mm.
So it's one of those things where the faith or the religion of a person doesn't come into play when they talk about, oh, this person robbed a bank, or this person committed murder, or this person did whatever crime. I mean, there's so many bad things that human beings can do, unfortunately. The difference is that those who perpetuate these atrocities, they justify their actions using the Muslim scripture, the Quran, or cherry picking certain sayings of the Prophet out of context. And there's a bit of a psychology behind this, which is these people have gotten to a point where they've already made the decision that they want to commit these acts. They want to kill people. They want to, cause mass destruction. They want to take over property and set up their own kind of mini territory or caliphate or whatever. And once they've made that decision of this is what I want to do, then they go look and try to find justification for that behavior.
Mm.
And because there's not much mainstream understanding of what the actual teachings of Islam are, they can get away with that. I mean, a simple example, a few years ago, there was a kind of a spate of bombings at abortion clinics by fundamental Christian activists,
Hmm.
where they saw that abortion is murder, and people who commit these who do these operations are actually committing murder, and so they justified it. Right now, that spate of attacks didn't really last very long and didn't really get much attention because, quote unquote, everybody knows that just because Christianity or fundamental Christianity disapproves of abortions, it doesn't justify the killing of people and doctors and nurses or accosting those who are going in to have this operation. So the basic understandings of Christian values and Christian ethics is already mainstream common knowledge. The same is not true about Islam.
Yeah.
And so basically it's whichever pundit you want to listen to. If you want to listen to CNN, you want to listen to Fox, you want to listen to, the Drudge Report. I mean, there's so many different outlets now. It really is a choose your own bias kind of world that we live in, especially with the echo chamber of social media, where a person is only going to selectively hear the stories that already fits his worldview. They're not going to see the other side usually. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of what motivated me to write this book. And that for a long time I was an email correspondent for an organization called whyislam.org. So it's a website offering just the facts, nothing more, nothing less, just accurate information, authentic information. Ask a question, whatever you want. And so I was one of their correspondents for a long time. And I don't know why, through luck or through bad luck, my dispatcher noticed that I was one of the few volunteers who was comfortable responding to hate mail and really negative comments or emails from the visitors. And so I started getting more and more of these, like, okay, if you like this, here, we'll give the nice ones to the other guys. We'll give the nasty people to
Here
you,
you
Ahmed.
go.
So that's, I was a kind of a victim of my own success there. So a lot of times, I mean, it is true that maybe 20-30% of the people who came in with a bad, belligerent attitude, I wasn't able to change their mind over conversation.
Hmm.
But more than half, 60 to 70% of the people that I talked to, they kind of came around. They realized, okay, there is a difference between, what does Islam teach and what do Muslims do? And there's a big difference between what are these high profile, a small number of high profile fringe elements doing and what the vast majority of Muslims are doing around the world. And I was able to kind of, like I said, just kind of get past that barrier of what is the unknown and really kind of connect and say, look, we're people like you are, and we have the same values. Islam actually teaches that all religions ultimately come from the same source. And they started out as this, with the same core message. It just changed as generations and generations went along. So being able to make that connection was very powerful for me, especially when you can take someone who's a hater and kind of get him to come around and be like, all right, I can agree that what people are doing, everything that makes the headlines,
Hmm.
right, is not representative of mainstream modern, Islamic thought and what mainstream modern Muslims, do or condone.
Hmm.
That
Hmm.
was very powerful for me. And so I realized that, Muslims are still a minority in the Western world. And very few people actually have an opportunity to, talk to a Muslim or know a Muslim, whether it's a coworker or a classmate or a neighbor. And a lot of the misconceptions that the media capitalize on to, get their clicks or get
Yeah.
their viewer rating,
Yeah.
uh, it, 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 it doesn't exist after a person knows someone, a Muslim, like, firsthand. And that's why, kind of my whole point of the book is, you know, for those who have never had the opportunity to actually know or talk to a Muslim about Islam, that's what this is. Ask your questions, real questions, get your straight answers. And, I don't whitewash things. I don't try to be politically correct.
Yeah.
I say, look, here's the traditional view, here's the modern view, and here's the mainstream view, and here's the extremist view. And most of the people have, this modern view, and it's, there's a difference between the teachings and the actions. And in fact, many of the heinous acts that make the headlines
Yeah.
are condemned by, like, these huge panels of religious scholars, guys with the big hats, and they, get the long beards, and they have, like, all these strings of, certificates and degrees behind their name. And they say, no, actually, the people who try to justify these acts using our holy book are wrong. And here's the, 17 or 25 page rebuttal of why they're not justified.
I love the fact that you're helping educate the world, if you like. We all do come from the same place, the same source. We live on the same planet. We're not going anywhere. So unity is obviously very important for our future collectively.
Yes.
If I may, could we talk about the Quran a little bit
Sure.
and interpretation of the written words? Now,
Right.
I don't know anything about it apart from the word infidel and the interpretation of one particular Muslim as opposed to another. Um, is this where the splintering, if you like, happens? Where you know a good Muslim turns bad? What is this about? This idea of an infidel, and how do we
Okay.
interpret that?
Let's jump right in. So first of all, I have three points on this. The first point that I'd like to make is that the word infidel actually doesn't come from the Quran. That is coming from polemic Christian literature, primarily from the Crusader era,
Right.
and that was primarily what the Crusaders called Muslims or Jews or anyone or even Orthodox Christians, those who were not of the Roman Catholic variety. So the word infidel doesn't appear in the Quran. If you try to count, infidel would mean like unfaithful
Right.
or something like that, right? But that's not the word that the Quran uses. The Quran has the word that's called kafir, and that doesn't even mean disbeliever, which is how it's sometimes translated. Kafir means rejecter. It means somebody who has received a prophet, whether it's Muhammad or Jesus or Moses or Abraham or David or Noah, may peace be upon them all, and rejected their call. That is what is meant by in the Quran, because the Quran was not revealed in one big revelation like like Moses receiving the tablets on Mount Sinai.
Yeah.
It didn't happen like that. It was over a period of 23 years, and it was like a living document that was interacting with the Prophet's current situation and the Muslim community's situation. And so many of the people who rejected his call, they were just that. They sat down, they heard what he had to preach, and they said, no, we like our idols, we like our old way of living, we don't want to think about an afterlife or be accountable for our deeds. And so they rejected the call. And that's what the Quran talks about. It talks about those who rejected the prophet's call and then comparing them, because it brings stories of the previous prophets. Like, you're not the first prophet who's been rejected. When Jesus came, there were those who rejected him. When Moses came, there were people who rejected him. When Noah was calling his community for so many, many, many years, they rejected his call. That's the first clarification I like to make. The
Thank
word
you.
infidel
Yep.
doesn't really have a basis in the Quran. Second of all, there is a difference, and this is something that many scholars or even a basic student of knowledge would know, is that there's a difference between someone who is not Muslim and someone who has rejected Islam, right?
Right.
And all of the speakers that I've talked to, all of the scholars that I've talked to and that I've learned from, they said the problem is that people look at the Quran, which is talking about those who are trying to kill the Prophet, trying to persecute his followers, trying to attack the city and basically wipe it out. They're the ones who are called kafirs in the Quran. In other words, those who are belligerent and actively fighting with lethal intent on the Prophet and his followers, and even the neighbors of the Prophet, even if they're not Muslim. And that's why the Quran takes such a harsh tone, because this is after 13 years of the Prophet was peacefully preaching, when he was eventually driven out of his home in Mecca, and he had to migrate, him and his community, all the way to Medina. And the people of Mecca, the elders, if you will, because it was more like a tribal oligarchy,
Mm-hmm.
they sent an ultimatum to the city of Medina. The Muslims were only about 30 or 40% of the population. The majority were pagan, and there were also a few major Jewish tribes. And the Prophet made kind of a commonwealth pact about, okay, we're different religions, but we all should, band together to be, a common defense, because this is one city. And so this ultimatum came from Mecca saying, okay, we don't have a beef with you guys. All these people who came from Mecca, bring them back so we can punish them, and we'll leave you alone. If you don't, then realize that we're going to attack you with all the full force of our tribal armies. And that's basically the context behind which this happened. So the context and the history of what is going on when these verses of the Quran are revealed are a very, very important part of understanding how do you make sense of these verses? How do you make sense of all of these calls about fighting and defending and be strong and get some? It's because these verses were revealed in the context of a community under siege.
Mm-hmm.
And so the verses are for that. And so there's always a difference between, and this is important to note, there's a difference between the verses which are generic, be good to people, قُولُوا لِلنَّاسِ حُسْنًا, which means, and say good words to people. Be fair, be just, even if it is against those people that you have, animosity with. Be fair and be just, even if it is against people who are part of your family. These are the general teachings of Islam, right?
Yep.
The specific contextual parts of the verse of the text, that which talks about, okay, when you are being attacked, what is the religious or what is the God conscious way of responding? Number one, Islam is not a passive religion that says you just let violence happen to you. It says you have a right to defend yourself, and you have a right to prepare, force if necessary. If there's a big tribe or a community coming after you, yes, you are permitted to prepare for the defense of your city, the defense of your home, the defense of your country. That's allowed. And interestingly enough, Thomas Aquinas, when the Christian theologian, when he was formulating his theory of a just war, he actually borrowed a lot from the the Spanish Muslim philosophers about this whole theory of jihad and when is it permissible to wage war, when it is not permissible to wage war, when it is permissible to use lethal force if you're defending your home, if you're not defending your home, if you're on the road. These kinds of like legal, ethical, theoretical teachings, he used that to build up how is a Christian allowed to become a soldier. Do you see what I'm saying? And this is something that I found is that people forget that the context of why the Quran or why different verses of the Quran were revealed are a critical part of understanding the Quran as a whole.
I'm sitting here thinking to myself, there are so many, misinterpretations, and I'm guilty of it. You sit there and you watch the media, and you're listening and you're observing, and you make a decision based on the limited information that you have without really deep diving into the history that we're sharing here today. So, Ahmed, it's just, I'm so thankful for you coming on the show today. Now, may I ask, what is the person's name who leads your faith in your local area? What are they called?
So there are three different kind of honorifics. The basic word is imam, so that's usually spelled I-M-A-M, and that literally just means the leader, the one who's in front. So they're the ones who lead the prayer service. So there are 5 daily prayer services at a full-time mosque, and this is usually the one who's the person who has been hired by the community because he's memorized the entire Quran, that he's the one who would lead the prayers and also give the sermons on Friday. There's another honorific which is called sheikh, and sheikh it literally means elder. So just like how you have elders in a church, you have elders in a synagogue, a sheikh is just an elderly person who is usually a scholar who has some deeper knowledge of the Quran, not just has memorized it and can recite it well
Yes.
and like that. Yeah. And the third honorific that people have is called Maulana, but that's more of a cultural I want to say it's like a nickname. Maulana literally means, our master or our superior one. And it's kind of tongue-in-cheek. It was an old term that was used for kings. And so sometimes in a congregation, if somebody wants to flatter or compliment a sheikh for his sermon or an imam for his recitation, he'll say, "Oh, you're the Maulana. You're the best among us," type
Ah.
of a thing. So it's not an official title, but you will hear that if you go in Muslim circles where they'll say, and this is actually where the word mullah comes from.
Right, right.
So I know that mullah, mullah Omar and all these things. So the word mullah is actually a contraction of the word maulana, which literally just means our master or our superior. Kind of it's a compliment,
Yeah, yeah.
but not a.
There are so many different dimensions to this conversation that we could explore. I'm sure there's many hours involved. On that, I'd love to pivot to the book itself and some of the topics that you talk about inside of your wonderful book.
Yeah. So my first book happened to be, my first book was basically, when I originally, came to the idea of I need to document and publish all of these conversations, because some of them are really, some of them are basic, question, answer, done.
Yeah, yeah.
But a lot of them were back and forth. And those are the conversations that I felt would really be helpful to fostering dialogue and tolerance and kind of understanding between the different faiths. So my initial idea was, okay, I'm going to put everything chronologically. I'll do my first 2 years and the next 4 years, the next 4 years, and then the last few years. That didn't work out too well because my first 2 years, which is from 2009 to 2011, which is where the first book is based on, I do have a nice sampling and variety of conversations. You have people coming in very hot and very, very belligerent, about jihad and about Islamic law and how it's very harsh and, you know, how can Islam ever be called a religion of peace and that kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
You also have people who are coming from the opposite end, those who are coming, very, very, they're interested about learning about Islam. How does the Quran inform your faith? What are the etiquettes of visiting a mosque? What are the details or the deeper meanings behind, the prayer or the charity or the pilgrimage, which are in Islam, which are the primary acts of worship,
Mm-hmm.
the 5 daily prayers, fasting during Ramadan, giving charity, and then the Hajj, the pilgrimage. So you got people coming in from kind of a sympathetic, almost soul-seeking point of view. And then you have those who are kind of random, like, faith and marriage and sex in Islam, right? And then you have those who talk about salvation and tolerance. That's very theological. You have those who talk about, culture and modernity, Muslim culture and modernity. So that's kind of sociological. Then you have, one of my favorite conversations is basically a Christian man who originally from Ireland. And he says, can Muslims and Christians ever actually live in harmony? I mean, I see all these things happening. Is there any ever hope for peace between us? And I said, no, and I was able to kind of pull in his Irish background. I said, just like you had the IRA and, the Protestants and the Catholics had quite a long history of nasty relations, but then it smoothed over because ultimately these kind of fights, they're not about religion. They're about politics. They're about self-determination. They're about the land. They're about, sovereignty, who has the right to make the laws, these kind of, not religious concerns.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that they're fighting because you worship this way and I worship that way. They're fighting because, I don't want to pay a tariff or I don't want to pay taxes if I go here and I want to be able to do that. And why am I being taxed for this? And why don't I get represented in your parliament? And these kinds of grievances.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And so that first book is kind of a potpourri. It's a mix of all these different types of conversants. Those who are coming in belligerent, those who are coming in sympathetic, those who are soul searching, those who are looking for peace and want to understand, and those who are coming from an academic point of view. And okay, what is this about? Right? About God's grace and free will. Does that actually exist?
Mm-hmm.
You see. And so that was my first book. Then my second book was actually a take off of one of the visitors from the first book, which was basically going through the Quran. So that's why we called it. My second book is called the Quran Discussions. And so instead of many conversations with different people, it's one very long conversation with one person who's kind of reading through the Quran from the beginning to the end. We never actually got to the end because by the time he got about 1/3 or 1/2 of the way through, he said, okay, this is a lot easier to understand right now. And I said, yeah, because all of the tough, the heavy, the legal and the social and the political verses are in the beginning of the Quran. The rest of it are like stories of the prophets, general ethics, morality, reminding people of the last day, accountability, be a good person. So those are kind of, are much easier to interpret because they're very general. They're not as tightly bound to the historical context. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then the third book was where I took later conversations where I wanted to really kind of focus on the biggest demographic of people who ask questions about my faith, which are our Christian brothers, those who, whether again coming from a position of belligerence or a position of questioning or a position of trying to find understanding. The third book is like the first book, but it's primarily from those who self-identify as Christians. So their questions are usually comparing and contrasting with Christianity. Whereas the first book was kind of generic, what about this? What about that? Why do Muslims do that? Why does Islam teach this? And that kind of a thing. And then the fourth book, which I actually just finished last year, was more about Islamic law and theology. So this is where I had 3 really long conversations, very thoughtful conversations. The first one was basically someone who was a secular humanist, an atheist.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was questioning all religion, but, Islam in particular. And so I found this very helpful because a lot of the Muslim youth in this country, they go off to college and then they encounter all the different type of philosophies in the world. And there comes a time, I think, in any person who has faith, there comes a time in their life when they start questioning that faith, when they start saying, okay, is this really the truth? Does this speak to me anymore? Can I reconcile it with, the modern world? And a lot of the questions and critiques of this guy, it mirrored my own soul searching process, about, what about this aspect of Islam? What about that aspect of Islam? How can you reconcile this and that? Very deep, very theological, about history of Islam. And so I included that. The second one was actually a religious studies teacher who teaches, religion, religious studies and philosophy. And so he had a lot of questions about the problem of evil. How can you believe in an all-powerful, all-benevolent, all-knowing God when all this suffering is happening? So that was a very nice conversation. And then the last conversation was basically a lady who, was thinking about converting, but she had a few concerns, and she wanted to discuss some of those concerns with someone who was knowledgeable. And I was able to, praise God, alhamdulillah, I was able to provide that resource to her. So I try to make it that each book is different from the other. Otherwise, if I just went straight chronological,
Yes.
there would be nothing there'd be nothing that would really differentiate one. It's like, okay, it's more random conversations, more of the same.
And when people want to access this wonderful library of resources, where would they find them?
So it is published on Amazon as well as Apple, the iTunes store.
Yes.
It's also on Barnes and Noble, and I think I'm also on Kobo. So I know there are some people who like ebooks on Kobo. They don't like to go to the big the big tech companies. They think that they're I actually get a lot of customers from Kobo, but I guess because they don't want to pay the big man.
The big man. Well, look, there you have it, everybody who's on the call today. This has been a wonderful treat, spending some time with somebody who's very well educated. Ahmed, it's been an absolute treat spending some time with you on the My Future Business show today.
Thank you so much, Rick. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks for joining us today. If you enjoyed the call, then make sure to subscribe, leave a comment, share us with your friends, and book your spot on the show at myfuturebusiness.com/interviews. And if you're looking for solutions that will help grow your business, then visit myfuturebusiness.com/shop.